question, and it got me thinking.
Yeah.
But I really didn't have anything to say. I didn't know what to say. I was like, man, I don't know.
Yeah.
I went with the joke response. I couldn't think of anything.
But I didn't see yours. What was yours?
I said, if you're MacGyver, it's an extra tool to get yourself out of a jam.
Well, one of the people had my earlier response when I was much younger is it serves basically as something that an opponent in the fight could grab you by, you know. So that's one of the first things I learned as a paramedic is if you wear a tie, wear a clip-on, you know, because people flip out, especially when they think they're dying and they grab on your tie, and you want to like let them have the tie without resistance.
Well, I think we're probably about ready to get going.
Are we ready to get started? Welcome everybody to Brainstorming the Human Connection. And we're going to be talking today about staying positive. And I think that's a very useful thing, especially in these times that we're living in. It's so easy to be negative. It's so easy to see all the dark spots and focus on that, and at the expense of other things, at the expense of all the nice things and the good things that are happening. And also with people, you know, it's easy to focus on people's deficits more than what they have positive. It's easier to find what people do wrong than to do right. At least it seems so. I don't think it really is, but it seems so in terms of our practice. Even when we're talking to children, for example, they can do a lot of things that require quite a bit of effort on their part. And no one will say almost anything. But if the kid does something just a little bit off, everybody's ready to pounce on the kid and correct that kid, you know? So it's like a whole smorgasbord of things that we could find that's wrong in the worlds that we live in without finding the things that are right. So today I want to talk about being positive and how you can find more positive things in your life. So the first question, or the first thing we need to do, is to define what we mean by staying positive. And different people will have different ideas about what that is. So I would like to have your concepts, opinions about what it means to you to be positive or to stay positive. What does that mean to you? We have no positive people here. I have no clue. Positive. Never heard of that.
I think if you go back to, like, you know, this was something that I remember as a kid in the 1970s, something that you would see around a lot was the word yes. I think the word yes, in a way, you know, especially in that time period, I remember as a kid, it kind of helped shape that sense of positivity for me, which was to be able to say yes to something was to create possibility. So possibility and positiveness kind of had an intrinsic link there, you know, the ability to create or have a possibility of something versus, I mean, but the thing is, you can't almost define it without defining its antonym or its opposite, which was no, meaning limit or, a certain course of action versus, a lot of possibility.
Yes.
Yeah, I just to build on Todd, I think that that's great. I was thinking in the thinking about it in terms of the absence, like it's so easy to see what's missing, which seems like a negative thing. And I fall to looking at is the glass half empty or half full as kind of a way to distinguish between, positive and negative. It's the same amount of water in the same size glass, but do we look at the absence or do we look at its fullness? And then I always think about the adage like, oh, you're so positive. Oh, she's so positive. Well, what does that really mean? Does it mean that she's like missing some information? I don't know. And sometimes sometimes I hear she's so positive is a good thing, or sometimes it's a bad thing. I don't know. This is a tricky question.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a tricky question. That's the only kind I know, tricky questions.
You're a tricky kind of guy, Lawrence.
That's what I do. I'm tricky. The trickster. How about you, Grace? What do you think is
Well,
positive?
When I think of positive, I think of good health. I think of feeling a sense of fulfillment and being healthy and being satisfied and working to be in that condition, because it's easy to fall the other way, to see all the negative, like you mentioned, because there is so much negative in the world around us now. All the news and all the things that, you turn on the news right away and all you hear are mainly negative stuff right away. And so, but that I was taught that, and I hope I tell other people and work with other people, that anything can be a positive if you switch it around and try to work things to make it more positive. Again, every morning I smudge, and I try to get my mindset to think in a good way. What am I going to do today that will be positive and that will lift people up and encourage people to want to do good things? And it's hard sometimes. I will share with our little group here that I lost my father last Wednesday. He died from COVID complications, but he lived a really good life. He was 91 years old. He went through all kinds of tragedy and things in his early life because he lost his mother at a young age, and he was moved around from home to his different relatives. Luckily, relatives who loved him and took care of him. But it was, not the most stable of environments, if you think about that, because he had so many different moves all the time, and ended up at boarding school and lost his language and culture, and had to really fight for his education. But he did. He got a bachelor of in education from Northern, and he taught for many years. He was the superintendent at the highest or the largest junior high school, they call them then instead of middle schools, but junior high school in Southern California at one time. So he retired, was a retired educator, and did so many good things in his life. And so I thought about the positive things that he shared with the world and with us as a family. And so that gives me comfort. And also I know that he's in a better place now. He lived a long time, and he's happy now. And so he's positive. So that's what so you can look at things in different ways and hopefully make your life better by trying to stay positive. And thank you for your comment, Ryan. I appreciate your comments. That's it, Lawrence.
Yeah, and ditto on Ryan's comments. Sorry for your loss. Even when we're ready to accept people going on to the other side, it still puts a hole in our heart.
Yes.
Times. And
Yeah, it does.
Anyone else? Charlie's?
Charlie.
Charlie's.
I don't get that. I don't get that very often. It connected with what Jay said. It really helps me to think comparatively. So in mourning her father, she remembers in a very affirmative way who he was, what he went through to still be the person he was for her. And so that, I think, is extremely revealing. And so thinking comparatively helps me all the time. You know, I've done some doctoring lately consistent with my age. And if I am sitting in clinics and feeling sorry for myself, and all I have to do is look around and feel kind of ashamed, because I'm fortunate to be as healthy as I am at my age. And I am fortunate not to have dealt with some of what people deal with lifelong. You know, I'm kind of embarrassed for myself sometimes if I'm indulging in self-pity. So thinking positively and thinking comparatively is always very helpful to me.
Anyone else on what? Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah. I've struggled throughout my life to maintain positivity, and one of the ways I've done that is, you know, I went through a divorce, which was difficult, painful. I was, you know, left from, you know, and I had 2 kids that I could focus on, young kids that were positive, energetic forces in my life every day that would help me do that. And I had a job I loved as a reporter in the Capitol, back when there were actually reporters in the Capitol, a lot of them. And that focus and my outdoor recreation focus. And so those are the kind of things that lift me up. My writing, both some poetry and the writing that would often, I could write my way out of a deep funk and find a positivity in myself and in the world through my writing. And I think the last year, we talked about health challenges, and I've had a lot of health challenges in the last year, more than I've ever had in my life. I've just turned 70. And I think it's been hard for me to be positive. My spiritual life has struggled, you know, because I've looked for solace in prayer throughout my life and have struggled with that. I think when you get up each day, and now, ironically, one of the things that's hard for me is to write. The physical symptoms that I have kind of make me sick if I read or I write too much. And so the magic potion I had all those years to sit down at a computer and a typewriter and a notebook is a lot harder work than it used to be, but it still in the end makes me feel better. And I think, and like as Chuck said, when I look around at people and I think, you know, some people have struggled with this kind of stuff their whole lives. You know, I didn't really face a hard year like this until I was almost 70. And I think you try to remain positive, not knowing what's ahead. And that's a difficult thing as what's ahead is shorter, for sure. And then if you have health concerns, you wonder how much shorter. But still find help in my writing and in short poems that I read and write, and in relationships with people like Chuck and Charlie. I'm going to start calling you Charlie.
You got to put the S in there too. Charlie's.
And
I'm coming at you with a few nicknames. I'm just the wheels are turning.
And of course, humor. You know, humor is we've talked about before, as Chuck has mentioned. Humor can save the day a lot of times. So,
Really like what Kevin said about his children who were saving grace for him back in the day. I find, especially at my age, a great antidote to sadness is spending time with little kids. And with my oldest daughter in her family last night, and they had a 2-year-old who's already very verbal and imitative. And his mom, my daughter, is very gregarious. We tease her about being a smoozer. She's a public relations person, does PR for firms online and so forth. And so he hears her phone conversations. And so last night I read a book to him. And when I'd finished, he smiled at me and he said, "Thank you so much, Papa, for reading to me." I said, "Okay, Laura." Because he's hearing his mom smooth people on the phone. "Thank you so much for reading to me." You know, that's something that stays with you. I was still laughing about it this morning. And so children are so hardening, I think, especially as you are in your golden years. The child is father of the man, as Wordsworth said.
Well, I just,
Go ahead, Andy.
I just need to come out and say, I'm just seeing the negative in the positive. And you know, like in terms of, Pollyanna or rose-colored glasses, there's just, you know, ways to couch being positive and the negative. And then the pressure of being positive, that, you know, make lemonade or a silver lining. And there's, you know, some pressure to be positive. So yeah. Again, this is just, I guess, shaking me up a lot, being positive. And, you know, I see myself, yeah, as a positive person and full of humor and hopefully a little bit of grace. But this has just struck me as the ways that we can dismiss positivity or force positivity in a way that seems counterproductive to being positive.
So what are some of the ways that we can be counterproductive in being positive? I'm not sure I'm understanding what you're saying.
Well, I think it's counterproductive to expect people to be positive all the time, you know, like, or point it out like, oh, there's a silver lining in this. And I mean, I think that it is very positive to look at the beauty in maybe the bad. But at the same time, you know, when we have smile, be happy, or, you know, we're surrounded by these pithy sayings of achieving happiness, or and this isn't to diminish anything of the profound conversation that we've been having about being positive, but I think there's a lot of pressure to be positive that makes it hard to be positive, because maybe I'm not being positive enough. So I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Or being positive is then dismissed as not seeing the whole picture or appreciating the complexity. You know, Pollyanna doesn't really see, or rose-colored glasses, you don't really see the truth. So there's ways to negate positive and people who have and dismiss the positive. I think that for some reason I seem to be in a swirl about in this conversation. I'm just being the nervous Nelly, see, you know, another dismissive term.
Well, it's interesting how you propose that. I see that all power is potential. And when there's something lacking, there's something to be done. And when there's something to be done, if you do it, then it seems to me that that's a positive. You know, you are engaged. You are engaged in some activity that, if the problem was meaningful to you, working on the solution would seem to be meaningful as well. You know, if it's not a problem big enough to work on, then to me, it's not a problem big enough to worry about.
Well, I like the concept that positive towards, is action. And not just complacency and description.
Betty, you were going to try to say something?
Yes. This reminds me of something Charles talked about last week. I think it was he who talked about not just sending a cliche-laden greeting card, but writing your own sentiments. And I think that this somehow applies here to what sounds like, is it Nancy? Is that the right name? Who's the lady who's been speaking? I'm sorry.
Annie?
Annie.
She looks like a Nancy, but she's an Annie.
Okay, I'm having problems with my silly little device here. It sounds as if she feels these things coming at her from all of us, or not, specifically, but from the outer. And to me, when I think of being positive, I look inside myself. If something's bothering me and I'm feeling that I'm not being positive, and try to figure out why. And because I think those cliche things that are all over the place are not very helpful. They can be as negative as they are positive. They're just something that somebody pulls off the wall and tosses to you, well-meaning. But it's kind of like when you're trying to help a child achieve self-confidence or know who they are, and you don't tell them specifically what they have done that pleases you or displeases you. You just throw these admonitions at them. It's much more helpful to have something specific in mind that can be active, or that you can pin on your own inner wall and say, yeah, that worked, that was good. I'll try to do more of that.
I agree with what Annie said. Seemed to be saying to me anyway, that we ought not to suppress other people's sadness or even our own, because that's there too. And if we want to be sympathetic, empathetic, we have to appreciate that and not be dismissive of it. My wife, an old friend, we used to laugh about this, who would not broach anything negative. And if anything like that came up, her mantra was just shut up and have a good time. Well, it's more complicated than that. And sometimes there's a prelude to leading into having a good time, which involves acknowledgement of what's not good and what is troubling another person or even yourself. We ought not to suppress sadness.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I think I'm conflating happiness with positive, and it's not. I mean, I think, Jay's in sharing your profound loss, one can be positive, but still profoundly sad.
Yeah. All of those above. Somebody else was going to say something, Kevin?
I was just going to say that some of the things that I find when people try to help that they say that I find really irritating. One of them is, remember, God never gives you more than you can carry. And I say, really? He doesn't? Have you looked around? Because there's a lot of dropped loads in the world these days. And the other one is that you just have to figure out, listen to what God's trying to tell you here through this. And I say, I don't think he's trying to tell me anything. I think he's got other things going on.
It's busy.
I think it's kind of leaving it up to me.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because there are all kinds of ways that we can exhibit being positive. And it's also interesting that it's also difficult to figure out what do we mean by positive. We can dance around it. We can give examples of well, this was positive and we can make comments on it. But when I say positive, what do I mean in that general term? Does it mean looking for opportunities? Does it mean seeing the bright side? Does it mean seeing something that rose, or that lotus that grows out of the mud, and focusing more on the lotus than the mud? What does it mean? I'm not suggesting any one of those are necessarily the one that you should have, but they are ones that others have proposed. And if we're going to talk about being positive, it's useful to clarify, at least to ourselves, what we mean by being positive. Okay, well, while you stew on that, be positive about that, how about another question? Do you believe in the power of being positive? Is there certain power in that? And if so, what is that power? What is the benefit of being positive?
Well, I think being negative makes me feel worse. So I'm assuming that being positive, regardless of what physical symptoms you're having or what life challenges you're having, if you're able to be positive, and I struggle with that, I assume being positive makes you feel better within the limitations of whatever you're struggling with. But I would rather be up near the top of those limitations than down near the bottom if I can. Not easy sometimes.
Certainly not easy in an environment which cherishes negativity, in an environment that cherishes the negative and puts emphasis on it. And I'll give you an example, as long as we're talking about newspaper guys. People often complain about newspapers and media being negative. And you say, look, I've witnessed, being a media person myself, I've witnessed that if you have a Boy Scout, and the Boy Scout helps the little old lady across the street every day and make sure she's okay. If you put that on your front headlines, see how many newspapers you sell, and then compare it to the Boy Scout rapes the little old lady, and see how many newspapers you sell, and see how many people talk about which story over coffee, or call up their neighbors and say something. So in a sense, I say, okay, look, we're blaming the news media, but really we're training them to do negative stories or put a negative spin on it. Even if it's a good story, it's almost obligatory that you say something negative, like, oh, but they didn't do this, or there's something wrong with this person, even though we don't want to say all the good stuff, because it somehow doesn't seem realistic if we don't put something bad about this person in there too, or have, quote, an opposing view. People just somehow dismiss the positive story about the person who did amazing things, but did not do anything bad. It's like when you have a protagonist, people find a protagonist that's complicated, i.e., they have some bad part about them too, much more compelling and interesting than the protagonist who does good stuff all the time. So I'm wondering if there isn't something in our psyche or in our milieu, our mix, that makes us cherish the negative. And I have lived with people who cherish the positive, so I know that it's possible. And the feeling is a lot different than in a place where everyone's looking for the negative. For example, there are all kinds of things that are happening right now. And if out of the millions of things that are happening, we pick the 100 that seem dire to talk about and reiterate and to dwell on, the world can seem to be going to hell in a handbasket. but all those other things are happening too. While there are really bad people, there are a lot of good people. Charles?
I'm reminded of another book I've read recently, which I highly recommend, and maybe I've mentioned in one of these conversations already. It's called Humankind, A Hopeful History by Rutger Bregman. I urge you to read this book because he says those kinds of things throughout. He says that about the media. He says they're giving us what we want, they're reporting the negative, and he argues very persuasively by most statistical measurements, things are getting better.
Yes.
In terms of number of wars fought, in terms of people dying of this, dying of that, in terms of unstable governments. And he pretty comprehensively proves that by most statistical measurements, things are getting better. And then he talks at some length about the narratives we live by, and he debunks them persuasively. I won't get into all that. You'll see for yourself, but we have these narratives which become metaphors for what people are. He contrasts these two historical figures, Thomas Hobbes, Hobbesian theory. I don't know if you know of him, but the ultimate pessimist whose mantra was life is nasty, brutish, and short. And then contrasting is Rousseau, the French philosopher, who believed in the natural goodness of man. And that's what Bregman argues, that most people, not all, he talks about other kinds of people, but most people, he argues, are good-hearted. They mean well. And he presents a lot of evidence to support that idea, but it doesn't sell newspapers, as you said. So I really highly recommend this book, Humankind, A Hopeful History.
Yeah, very good. Thank you for that, Charles. I remember I haven't read that book, but I remember having a conversation about it on some other level in some other venue. And it was pointed out that as bad as you think things are, it's hard to go to find any city where you enter the city and the main street you enter on, there are heads on pikes of the political enemy of the person who's in power. As much as you can say, oh, there's torture and all that stuff. Well, there was torture and stuff then too, but they didn't display it as heads on pikes when you walked in, and people thought, or you look at the Christian history and all those people on crosses. Christ wasn't the only person on a cross. They didn't invent crosses for Christ. He was just one more guy that they put on the cross, and they would line the streets with all the people who, to show people. We don't have that anymore, So I'm thinking there are lots of things that we could see that are improvements. And for some reason, as you were indicating, we tend to look for or pay attention or dwell on the things that are not so good. So what are the kind of things that we can do to make things better?
As a news entity these days, there is more and more push for good news reporting. And if you watch Kello TV, they've got a special on it. I can't remember the name of it. It's good news. And sometimes it's hokey, but sometimes it's pretty good. The last several years of my full-time journalism career, I was with Kello out of Rapid City, a one-person reporter, cameraman, everything. And I made it my mission to go particularly to the Pine Ridge Reservation, but also to Rosebud. Didn't get to the other reservations very much because those two were, so big and so sprawling and so close by, and do good news stories about kids succeeding in school and about families coming back together and about the tribal government making a good decision for people. And I knew that I was going to go down there when a tornado struck and there was devastation. And I knew that I was going to go down there when a 14-year-old got shot in a meth deal. And, I knew those stories were going to be covered. So every story that I pitched to Kello was a good news on the reservation story. And Kello said, yeah, go. And I can't tell you how much that lifted me, how much that lifted the people that watched Kello, and how many comments I got about, wow, I never realized there were so many good things going on there. That doesn't hide the bad, because that happens. You have to cover that.
Sure.
But the other thing was, I remember driving into Pine Ridge one time. This happened more than a dozen times, and having people see my Kello car, Native people, adults, and applaud,
Really?
stand and applaud and
Yeah.
cheer. Hey, Kello! Hey, Kello!
Yeah, yeah.
I never had that in journalism in my whole life. Come in there.
Yeah.
And it was because I was down there trying to tell the goodness of those people and that place and everything going on. And like I said, I think media outlets try to do some of that, but you know what takes off on the internet?
Yeah.
It's the nasty stuff.
Yeah.
You know what gets the hit on the internet? It's the nasty stuff. And they're all so internet driven right now, and hits and page views, that I think a lot of that gets lost.
Yep. Yes. Yes. And yes. Any things that, that's a very good example of things that we can do to make things better, Kevin. Any other examples of things that we can do to make things better, as long as we want to be positive? How do we do that?
If I might, I just want to reflect back to something that Chase shared with us. I think that there is a power in positivity. If not a power, it's empowering. I feel like I'm more capable or more able, I'm more engaged when, to make a difference. And Chase, you shared how you start your day to create the positive for the day. And I think that individually, that's something that I can draw from, of how to just cast the day with a sense of hope and positivity. And imagine if the entire world started our day that way, that would be empowering.
And in many ways, we are the entire world. That's how we live. That's the world that we live in. So if we start with ourselves doing that, there's a Jace ripple effect, that's out there, that she carries that positivity, and it's infectious. And there are a lot of balances in the world. Anyone else for ideas on what you do anyway to be positive? What kind of things do you do to make the world better? Adding some positive light. Jace, were you going to say something?
Well, since we're talking about what things we can do, I think we all have to do things that feel that our strengths, what we can do to make the world a better place, or to try to make our homes a better place. And that's how Grandpa Foolscrow, the medicine man and holy man from Oglala Lakota, medicine man and holy man, talked about in his teachings about starting with yourself, like you mentioned, praying for yourself and praying that you can do the best that you can in that day, and whatever has to be done that day, that you'll be strong and you'll be able to do your best to fulfill what should be done, whatever task or whatever you're supposed to do that day. And it can be from the mundane to like high tanning, or working on a pair of moccasins, or cooking a meal for your family. And a good example would be like feeding people. Like if you make a meal, you should have a positive thoughts when you're cooking, because when you cook, you you are putting that energy in the food, and you want your family to be healthy. You want the people, like if you're having a big feed where you like at a ceremony or so forth, you want the people there to feel good about themselves and about the food, and you pray about that when you're cooking it. And so when they eat it, then that positiveness goes into them. And so the opposite could be as well. If you're angry, if you're upset, or if you're, if you're in a negative mood, then also that goes into your cooking, and you don't want that for the people. You want them to be happy and to be fulfilled, not only sustained, because they've eaten, but also to be healthy. You want them to think healthy and be healthy. But as Lakota people, we believe that there are both good and bad in all of us as individuals. And that's just how our makeup is. Physically, that's, and mentally, spiritually, emotionally, that's how we are. We're both good and bad. But what steers us to be more positive is our actions and how we deal with the negative or the things that happen in the tragedies or whatever it is, and our faith and our belief in our Lakota ways and how we were brought up. And so, along with ceremony and prayer. So I have a big sign that's right next to my computer here that says believe, real big, believe. And the word for in Lakota, one of the closest words for that is Wowichala. And it means the belief and faith in our Lakota ways. I had a cousin that really was, when I was feeling down or I was feeling, he and I would talk to one another and share our frustrations and our sadness or whatever. But he died of COVID also, over a year ago now. But I always remember his words, though, that one of his favorite words was Wowichala, belief and faith. Always remember that, cousin, he would say, because that is what will sustain us, and that is what has sustained our relatives for thousands of years, for generations and generations. So times change, but not your inner self and your prayer and those things that help us to be better people don't change, so that those are still relevant today. They had the things that they had to deal with in the past. Well, we deal with things that we have to deal with now, COVID and other things. So I also wanted to make a comment to Kevin that I remember I smiled when he was talking about yay Kelowna and like that, because we feel real good when people share the positive things about our culture and the things that we're doing, instead of all the the negative stuff about the poverty porn and stuff like that. That's there's just too much of that. And so when positive things are done, that lifts us up, it lifts spirits up. And that's what we should do as human beings. We should lift one another up and encourage one another. And that's what our teachings remind us to do, to lift people up, hold people up. I think I've talked a lot, so I'll be
Thank
quiet.
you for sharing. Thank you for sharing all of that. Very useful. Very useful. Anyone else?
Could I just say too, what Jay said, I have never been, got white hair, and I've written about this. I've never been respected the way I was respected on the reservation as an older looking reporter. Two stories. I was covering an event, an anti-suicide event by a young woman at Little Wound School, a sophomore in high school. And I had been covering this story and promoting the story. And I went to cover a basketball event that they organized on that behalf. And I was there covering it. And, there's always a loudspeaker with those at Native events. And it's just great because whoever's got it is funny and he picks people out in the crowd, or she picks people out in the crowd, and they talk. And when I walked in, he said, I want you to notice Kevin Wooster here. He comes down for the good stories, not just the bad stories. And the whole place gave me a round of applause. This auditorium at Little Wound School. And then people came up and shook my hand afterwards. Again, some things never happened to me in journalism, that kind of stuff. But even more so at White Clay, which was a horrible place, of destitution and alcoholism and poor folks lying in the street. When I was covering a story there, and I was in the middle of a group of these fellas, and they were all inebriated, and kind of a fight broke out. And the one guy said, I could hear him say, "Get Grandpa back, get Grandpa back." And I said, "Wait a minute, who's Grandpa?" "Well, you are Grandpa, you are grandfather. And that is a great honor. And we would not let you get hurt." These were people that were in horrible shape in their lives. And they were protecting this white man elder that had come into their midst. And that left me feeling positive for about 3 months afterwards. I don't know if that has anything to do with what we're talking about, but it kind of dovetailed onto that.
Well, I think it has a lot to do with it. And I think that having the stories and realizing that we don't know enough about those kind of stories about reporters, that the reporters that do that kind of thing is, we need to have those kind of stories so that we lift those kind of reporters up. We need to spread those kind of stories, even if it's not on our social media or something like that, but between ourselves. So I'm very grateful that you share those stories with us, because now that gives us stories to share with other people, to say that, there are reporters who are doing things positive. There are reporters who are looking for those positive stories. Maybe you should find some of those.
Yeah.
Maybe we should support some of those and write the letters to the newspaper praising a story as much as we do complaining about a story. When we have a story that's positive, if we like positive stories, maybe that's a thing we could do to increase positivity.
I was just gonna say, I don't know if I'm muted or not, that even it doesn't have to be a big thing, just a smile or something. And even now that we have masks on, just smile with your eyes or something. That might be the only smile the other person got when they're maybe at the grocery store or anything. It doesn't have to be a big deal. I know when I taught, I had first graders, and they just say, "Good morning, sir. Good morning, ma'am." Teacher would say, "Come in the room." That's no big deal, but there's some kids, that's the only attention they've had all day. That someone recognized them specifically. You might not think it's a big deal, and you might think it's not even worth saying, but to that person, it might be a really big deal to them. It might make their day a lot better and a lot more positive. And they think, wow, someone noticed that I'm alive. You think that's kind of stupid, but some kids, nothing is said to them from the moment they get up till they walk into school. And if you don't say hi to them, nothing happens. We didn't all grow up in a house where you have a discussion, maybe at breakfast, at the breakfast table and stuff. Some kids don't have that. And not just kids, adults too. You never know if they just live totally alone and stuff. You might be their only human connection. And sometimes it doesn't have to be a long conversation or anything, just acknowledging them. And one thing about media on a positive note, I watch probably too much MSNBC, was watching it last night between the handoff from Rachel Maddow to the last word was Lawrence McDonald. I love those two shows. And Lawrence was talking about is I have a bit of good news. He said, I got on the website to order the test, home test for COVID. And he said it was so easy. You just, he said, I figured it would be screwed up or crash or who knows what. But you just get on it and put in your name and address and you're pretty much done. He said, I was just amazed. And he said, that kind of stuff doesn't get any news. If some program is screwed up, then that's what gets in the news. But he said, no one talks about something if it works well and it's pleasing people and doing what it's supposed to do. And that's true, sad but true.
I think along those lines, Deb, we often neglect our own personal power to make things different because we have this sense that, well, if I don't say it and 1,000 people hear it and respond to me, then I've been talking into a vacuum.
Yeah.
And that's just not true. I remember recognizing when I was in radio, how many times I had a radio program and it sometimes goes into the ether, but I could say something at a bar and wait for 6 weeks to a month or so, or a couple of months. And I would start hearing people repeating that line. And you went, I didn't get nearly that on the radio. I mean, yeah, maybe the gossip columns or something like that, they would pick up something I said or something I did and they would comment on it, something. But as far as just like sitting in a place and hearing somebody repeat a particular line that you had been putting out, it was amazing. And you realize that whole sort of 6 degrees of separation, that's powerful. If you say something or do something that has sticky eyeballs or sticky eardrums, like a jingle or something, it's amazing how people pick that up and repeat it. And it just becomes into the vernacular or how people talk, and nobody knows where it came from.
Exactly. And it can be the smallest thing. It doesn't have to be a really big to do.
Yes.
Sometimes you just say hello to someone or thank you. And they almost look at you with surprise. They can't believe that somebody even noticed them or said anything.
Yeah. Yep. And then it encourages those people to do something too.
Right.
Okay, so let's talk about gratitude as a way of wrapping up this subject. What role does gratitude have in being positive?
I think it's magical. It's magical. I've had some real strong life lessons when I decided to just appreciate and express my gratitude, even if I just did it on a piece of paper to myself. I don't know the science behind it, but it's helped me a lot in my life to be accepting and be positive, and people feel that, I believe. So excuse me, I just encourage people to find their reasons to be grateful, even if they're as simple as I woke up this morning, and write that down every day. 5 things was actually the prescription that I got from, oh shoot, I haven't thought about her name, but anyway, everybody knows who she is, and it worked for me in a major way. It's a power.
Superpower, gratitude.
Yeah.
Anyone else? The role that gratitude has on being positive.
I think it's so important because it just makes you look at everything in a more positive way, to be grateful. There was an email going around, probably it's been 10, 15 years ago, about all the different stuff that if you have a house, you're better off than like 87% of the world or something. If you have this, you're better off than somebody. After you read that, you think you can't possibly think of poor me kind of negative thought. You're like, I'm a really, in the eyes of most of the world, I'm really a rich person. Makes you look at things in a totally different way.
Thank you, Deb. Anyone else? The role of gratitude. Anybody? Todd?
Yeah, just
Todd?
briefly. I mean, my own experience, the way that I was kind of taught about that, those two topics, how they go together, is that gratitude's kind of like the door a lot of times. Positivity is the power. It's where the action is. And positivity as literally like an electrical power, it's a power. Gratitude is the door that you open. By having gratitude allows you to have that power. It's the place where it comes in. Without it, you do run the risk. And this is something that, and Annie had been talking about it briefly, is you don't want to be just pushing positivity. Without gratitude, it's very difficult, because then really all you're doing is like having a shouting match with negativity. But with gratitude, you kind of open up the door, let in that space, that brings the power in. Without it, it's really difficult. It is, it's really difficult. You kind of have to have that. And that's kind of the same thing, is that's the you part, right? Your gratitude is the you part. Positivity is what you share and what you push out to others. And so without it, it's kind of like you need both pieces to kind of really make it work as a system that can go out into the world. If you don't, you kind of, you're just back in that kind of like, I'm saying this to negate the other thing. That's not really a positivity. That's a negative thing. But even if you just repeat it, I'm not saying that, there aren't, scientific things about positivity that, just by saying it, your brain does pick up on that stuff. I get that. But if you really take it at the heart, the gratitude, it starts with the gratitude with you, and then it goes out into the positivity.
Thanks, Todd. Well, speaking of gratitude and positivity, I think kind of a bedrock on being positive is expectations. What is it reasonable to expect? Because often we measure things against the ruler of perfection. And unfortunately, that's an abstract measuring device. And you'll find that the goalpost changes. The measurements on the ruler keeps moving around on perfection. And so if we examine closely, what is it that is reasonable to expect under the circumstances, a lot of things change. At least it does for me. So even if you take like a particular person and you think, okay, what's reasonable to expect from this person, given what they are, given where they are at this moment in their life. I may wish them to be all kinds of things. I may wish them to be perfect, but they're not. They may have had a really bad day. They may have suffered a terrible loss, even in childhood, that they haven't gotten over. It could have been, the fact that they lost something, and humans have loss aversions. They may have loops in their brain that key being a pedophile, and people don't just typically, they don't really like pedophiles, right? But people, they recognize that, hey, there's a loop in the brain that makes this person like that. That's why they often give them life sentences, because they say this psychologist said this person's never going to change. His brain is like that. You can let him out, you can give him all kinds of things, but at this point, we don't have a therapy for him. He's going to be like that. And the only thing that's lacking is an opportunity, and you can't always shepherd that. So we're going to put him in prison for the rest of his life. Right? So when you say, well, what is a reasonable expectation? Well, it's an unreasonable expectation to think that person's going to be something different. That allows me to have a certain amount of positivity about that person while having them in prison so that they don't hurt any children, but not write them off as a whole human being because they have that particular deficit in their brain. You know, or people who are sociopaths, psychopaths, they also have limitations that are, you know, we can spot it. You know, we can say this person has this person has that. Chances are they're going to like to light the cat on fire and watch him burn because they have that. Okay, so, and our situation, you know, like you only have so much money and that person can only spend it on this, and they have a predilection to have this other kind of thing. So what are all of the things that come into play? And then is it reasonable to expect anything else? And without understanding those expectations, it becomes really hard. It's easy, let's say, not to be positive. So with that, I'll leave you with that, and we'll come back next week, same time, same station, and another interesting conversation. And I hope that when you get the notice, read the questions and the topic so that you'll have thought of some things to say, you know, and then we can have a even fuller conversation. Thanks. We'll see you guys next week.